Hello and welcome to the FollowInTruth podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing the truth about what the Bible really says. I'm your host LJ, and the title of this episode is, Does the Bible Condone Slavery? Many people, usually those who are not Christians, claim that the Bible condones slavery. They point to certain passages within the Bible itself that they say prove that the Bible not only condones slavery, but also gives rules regarding the application of it. They then often use this as an argument against a loving God, with the claim, how can a loving God allow such an abhorrently vile and evil act as slavery? They also point to the fact that the slave traders and owners in America used the Bible to justify their owning slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. The fact is that the American slave owners who used the Bible to justify their actions were just as guilty of cherry-picking verses, ripping them out of context and applying a meaning that is contrary to their actual meaning as those who are using the argument are today. Obviously, just with much more severe consequences as a result of doing so. Slavery, and I mean the type of slavery that the black African people were subjected to during the transatlantic slave trade, is wrong. It was wrong then, it is wrong now, and it would be wrong if the Bible condoned it. It is always wrong. There is no defense of such an act. There are some Christians who would say, if the Bible says that it is okay, then it is okay. They are also wrong, and that is not my position. This type of slavery is simply wrong, and if God said that it was not wrong, then that is not a God that I would, or in fact could, worship. Just in case anyone does not understand my position before we get into this study, I am 100% against slavery. I am not trying to argue that slavery, even if God ordained it, is okay. I would not say that it is okay just because God did, if God did. But God doesn't say that this type of slavery is okay. In fact, God flat out condemns it. If a person steals another person, then they are to be put to death. The punishment even goes as far as to say that the person that is found in possession of a person that has been stolen is to be put to death also. Ezekiel 21:16. And he that stealeth a man, and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. The punishment for taking a person against their will, then, is death. There is no harsher punishment imposed by God in the Bible. This should, in fact, be the end of the argument. But of course it isn't. Some people argue that this only refers to a person who steals a person who belongs to somebody else. This, though, is reading this interpretation into the verse. It only states that if one person steals another, then they are to be punished by death. The plain and straightforward reading of this would be that this is simply a blanket statement. Anyone that steals a person, or who has them in their hand, they are to be sentenced to death. Now, irrespective of this, there are in fact a number of passages that are often cited by those that claim slavery is not condemned, despite the clear statement of condemnation that we have just seen. So let's have a look at these passages and see exactly what else the Bible really says about slavery. The first thing that we must understand is that the Bible does not shy away from the act or fact of slavery. Slavery was a major part of the ancient Near East culture. It was not unusual for nations to enslave individual people, groups of people, or in fact whole other nations. The Israelites themselves were slaves in Egypt before they were redeemed by God out of that slavery. Slavery is referenced many times throughout the scriptures. However, there is a huge difference between a descriptive text and a prescriptive text. And we should not, and in fact cannot, allow a descriptive text, a text describing the act of slavery, to be confused with a prescriptive text, a text giving a rule on or the condoning of slavery, and then use this incorrectly applied descriptive text to claim that God prescriptively allows slavery. Simply taking a descriptive text and applying a prescriptive meaning into it is nothing short of disingenuous. Now, there are actually 3 different types of slavery in the Bible. Slavery by other nations of the Israelites, or other nations, slavery of Israelites by other Israelites, and slavery of those other nations by the Israelites. What we will find out is that only the first is a kind of slavery that we would even recognize as a kind of slavery that we understand today, when we input our conceptions of the transatlantic slave trade into the term. The literal ownership of one human being over another against the will of the person that is being owned, where the basic human rights to freedom of that person owned is removed. There are two Hebrew words that are translated as servant, bondman or bondmaid in the KJV, slave in some other translations, ebed, male, and abed, female. It is suffice to say that they do not always simply imply slave. Armies of the Israelites were called servants of Saul in 1 Samuel 17:8. The Israelites were not slaves of King Saul. The Israelites were called servants of Moses, Numbers 32:25. David, before he was king, was a servant, ebed, of the then King Saul, 1 Samuel 22:14. David was the son-in-law of King Saul. It would take a stretch of the imagination and would be quite incorrect to apply that David was a slave of King Saul. David called himself the servant of Achish, the king of the Philistines, 1 Samuel 28:1 and 2. David was not a slave of Achish. Abraham, Genesis 26:24, Moses, Numbers 12:7, Caleb, Numbers 14:24, David, 2 Samuel 3:18, and even the Messiah, Isaiah 42:1, were all called servants of God. Ebed could be and was clearly used of those that served a person but were not considered their actual slave. So let's look at these three different types of slavery. First, slavery of Israelites by other Israelites. In reality, what we will see is that this slavery between one Israelite and another Israelite was not slavery at all. Actually, this would be better, more accurately and often described as indebted servitude. Indebted servitude could be implemented for many different reasons, as we will see. Number 1, poverty. Leviticus 25:39. And if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee until the year of Jubilee. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return unto his family, and unto the possession of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. It was possible that if an Israelite found themselves being poor for whatever reason, that Israelite could sell himself to another Israelite in return for a financial benefit. The selling and buying would be by mutual consent. The servant would work for the master, and the master would in turn provide for the servant. However, the master was not to make the servant serve like a bondservant. He was specifically to be treated as a hired servant, or sojourner. The sojourner reference here will become relevant again later on. This did not mean that one Israelite could sell another Israelite to a third party. The Hebrew of verse 39 makes this clear that this is a brother who is poor, who sells himself, not that he is sold by a third party. The Israelite is the servant of God, and therefore not to be sold as a bondman. Both servant and bondman here translated from the same Hebrew root word ebed, showing the two meanings of the word. The passage says that the Israelite servant who had sold himself was to be treated as any other hired servant, or what we would call an employee. We will get to the treatment of the Israelites a little later in this study. It shouldn't go without mentioning that God had actually declared that if the Israelites would have fully followed him, he promised to bless them, so as there would be no poor amongst the Israelites. Deuteronomy 15:4. Save when there shall be no poor among you, for the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, for an inheritance to possess it. Only if thou carefully hearken unto the voice of thy Lord thy God, to observe to do all these commandments which I command thee on this day. For the Lord thy God blesseth thee, as he promised thee, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow, and thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. God had also actually commanded that the Israelites help the poor. That would arise from the Israelites not following God. Deuteronomy 15:7. If there be among you a poor man, of one of thy brethren, within any of thy gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother, but thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. God again gave instruction to the Israelites to provide for the poor and the stranger. Leviticus 19:9. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. The Israelites were not to charge interest on money lent to a poor Israelite, and they were to sell him food at cost. Leviticus 25:35. And if thy brother be waxen poor, and fallen in decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve him, yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Take thou no usury of him, or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals of increase. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. Every third year the tithes of the Israelites were to be shared out between the Levites, the poor, and the strangers. Deuteronomy 14:28. At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and thou shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. The whole system designed by God was to prevent poverty from arising in Israel, but then also eliminating it if and when it did. Over and over, God makes provisions to protect the poor amongst the Israelites, so they would not need to sell themselves in the first place, including the cancellation of all debts every 7 years, which we will look at in a bit, if only they would follow him. 2. Punishment for crime. For those crimes that did not carry the death penalty, such as theft, the punishment would be to pay restitution. If a man stole something from another, he would have to pay back what he stole plus an extra cost. If the man had no means in which to repay this debt, then he would have to work off that debt by becoming the servant of the person he owed the debt to. We have to remember there was no prison system back then. Rather than going to jail, the punishment for the crime that didn't carry the death penalty would be servitude. Exodus 22:2. If a thief be found breaking up, and be smitten that he die, there shall be no blood be shed for him. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him. For he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. The thief himself, or rather his productivity, his work, his time, being sold to pay off the debt and his fine. 3. Acquisition. Jacob, or Israel, put himself into servitude for the right to marry Rachel. He voluntarily served, or worked for, her father Laban, for the right to marry her. Genesis 29:15. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favoured. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. In no way can any of these 3 indebted servitudes be conflated with the definition of slavery. This indebted servitude of Israelites was indeed regulated by God, and rightfully so. There were strict laws regarding the treatment of those who were in indebted servitude and served to protect the person who was in the indebted servitude. Servitude of Israelites was to last a maximum of 6 years. In the 7th year, the master was to allow the servant to go free. Exodus 21:1. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy an Hebrew Israelite, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Deuteronomy 15:12. And if thy brother, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee. At the end of the 6 years' service, a Hebrew servant, or an Israelite, was not only to go free from their service, but they were also to be furnished by the master, given a parting gift, in honor of that service. This parting gift would include cattle, food, and wine, which is laid out in Deuteronomy 15:13, 14, and 15. This year of release happened every 7 years. If the Israelite became indebted 4 years into the 7-year service, then he would serve the remainder of the 6 years, which would be 2 years, and then be set free. Although it was not part of the law, the Israelites did start to hold the children accountable for their father's debts after the father had died, as we see in the case of the woman who appealed to Elisha for help in 2 Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings 4:1. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. This rather famous biblical story is where Elisha tells her to obtain vessels to put oil, and then he provides enough oil for her to pay her husband's debt. The non-release of the Israelites who were in indebted servitude by their masters was something that Jeremiah addressed, Jeremiah 34:8. This is the word that came unto Jeremiah from the Lord. After that the king Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people which were at Jerusalem, to proclaim liberty unto them, that every man should let his manservant and every man his maidservant, be an Hebrew or an Hebrewess, go free, that none should serve himself of them, to wit, of a Jew his brother. Now when all the princes and all the people which had entered into this covenant heard that every one should let his manservant and every one his maidservant go free, that none should serve themselves of them any more, then they obeyed and let them go. But afterward they turned and caused the servants and the handmaids whom they had let go free to return, and brought them into subjection for servants and for handmaids. However, it was possible, if the servant so wished, that he could remain as a servant of his master after the 6 years were completed. This, though, was to be the servant's own choice. This did not allow the master to keep the servant after the 6-year period against the servant's wishes. The master could not force the servant to remain. If the servant chose to remain at the end of his term, then it would be the servant who had the right to do so. Deuteronomy 15:16. And it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee and thine house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl, and thrust it through his ear unto the door, and he shall be thy servant forever, and also unto thy maidservant thou shalt do likewise. But even after this is stated, the fact that the servant was free to finish his service after 6 years is repeated, just in case it was not understood, God proclaiming that the master should not find it difficult to let the servant go. Deuteronomy 15:18. It shall not seem hard unto thee, when thou sendest him away free from thee, for he hath been worth a double hired servant to thee, in serving thee 6 years, and the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thou doest. This is also explained in Exodus chapter 21. Exodus 21:2. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges, he shall also bring him to the door, or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Now forever here does not mean a literal forever, even though some do try to assert that it does. Obviously, a person could not remain a slave after they die. Therefore, forever, even in this understanding of forever being a literal forever, can only mean unto death, which is not forever. But forever actually means until the year of Jubilee. Now this is when all Israelites were to return back to their own families and their own land. This was the longest that one Israelite could serve another Israelite. They could stay after the 6-year service, but at the Jubilee there was no choice to remain. This is highlighted back in Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25:39. If thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was when all debts were to be settled, all accounts restarted back to zero, and everyone back on an even keel. All possessions returned back to their original owner. In all essence, a full factory reset. The Jubilee year is explained in detail in Leviticus chapter 25. Leviticus 25:8. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a Jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. A Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the Jubilee. It shall be holy unto you. Ye shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. All possessions were to return to whom they were given as a possession. Leviticus 25:13. In the year of this Jubilee ye shall return every man unto his possession. And if thou sell out unto thy neighbour, or buyest out of thy neighbour's hand, ye shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years of the Jubilee thou shalt buy of thy neighbour, and according to the number of years of the fruits he shall sell unto thee. According to the multitude of years thou shalt increase the price thereof, and according to the fewness of years thou shalt diminish the price of it. For according to the number of the years of the fruits doth he sell unto thee. Ye shall not therefore oppress one another, but thou shalt fear thy God, for I am the Lord your God. It was forbidden for the Israelites to make any Israelite servant serve with rigour. This is explicitly stated in the law. Leviticus 25:43. Thou shalt not rule over him with rigour, but shalt fear thy God. Rigour here is the Hebrew word perek, and it means rigour, harshness, or severity. With rigour is how the Egyptians made the Israelites serve. Exodus 1:13. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigour. The Israelites were not to be made to serve in this way. Neither could the master oppress his servant. Leviticus 25:17. Ye shall not therefore oppress one another, but thou shalt fear thy God, for I am the Lord your God. So when actually analysed, what we have here is a very clear condemnation of slavery, the enslavement of one Israelite on another. Literally, God here is condemning one Israelite making another Israelite his slave. It was strictly forbidden to do so. So we see that there simply was no such thing as an Israelite slave. There is no condoning by God of Israelite on Israelite slavery. In fact, there was strict condemnation against it, and laws in place for the well-being of the servant, even those servants who we would more consider prisoners today. Next, we have slavery of those other nations by the Israelites. A verse that is so often cited as proof that the Bible does sanction the enslavement of persons from other nations by the Israelites is Leviticus 25:44. Leviticus 25:44. Both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are around about you. Of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. So the assumption here is that the Israelites were allowed to take slaves from other nations and buy and sell them. However, this again is simply reading into the text a meaning that simply does not exist. The verse does not say that the Israelites could go out into the other nations and simply take anyone they so wished from among those nations and make them their slaves. Neither does it say that the Israelites could sell these strangers to other Israelites, or anyone else for that matter. This all has to be read into the meaning of this verse, a meaning that is very clearly contrary to the condemnation that we have already seen. It is totally dishonest to read this understanding into this verse in light of the clear condemnation. The condemnation simply has to be ignored when interpreting this verse in order to even start to interpret this verse as an endorsement for the Israelites to make slaves of other nations. So, what does this actually mean? It was quite possible for a stranger, someone from a foreign nation, who wanted to join the Israelites, to sell themselves into Israel. This was not the indebted servitude as of the Israelites, but the Israelite buying the services of a stranger who wished to join Israel. By doing this, they could join the Israelites and be partakers in the land, but they could not possess the land. As the strangers would not have any tribal affiliation or any other right to any of the land or property within Israel, seeing that they were not actual Israelites and therefore had no possession given to them, in order to be able to survive in the land of Israel, they would have to align themselves with one of the Israelite families. They would sell themselves, simply meaning that they would come and work for their new family and be as a member of that family. They would become a servant of the Israelite family, but this does not mean that they were to be made slaves. They would work for the family just like any other member of the family would. These strangers had very specific rights as a member of the family, and they were to be treated as such. Then we have a passage that is often used to show that it was perfectly okay for the Israelites to buy and sell their slaves as they wished. Leviticus 25:45. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession, and ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with rigor. The misrepresentation of this passage is quite staggering. Notice that this is specifically talking about the strangers that sojourn amongst you. This means that they are already a part of Israel. This is now not talking about any other stranger apart from those that are already dwelling in Israel, those strangers that had already aligned themselves with an Israelite family as per the previous verse. This simply does not mean that the Israelites could go out and take slaves from the strangers that do not reside in Israel, then buy and sell those strangers that they had made slaves. Now there is a subtlety that most people miss here. In verse 45, it specifically states that the children of the strangers that sojourn amongst you may you buy. Notice that the children could only be bought. There is no mention of these children being sold. This is not giving permission for the Israelites to simply buy and sell the children of the strangers living in Israel to other Israelites without the permission of these children. So what, again, does this actually mean? The Hebrew word translated as children here is bene, and it means sons. Now this is not a reference to little children, but offspring, the sons of the strangers, the Israelites themselves being called the children of Israel. This could refer to a person of any age. All this actually means is that the services of the stranger's offspring could be bought by the Israelites, and that the son of the stranger would then work for their Israelite family, just as their parents did, and also become part of Israel. They would have all the same rights and protection that their parents did. They would be able to stay in Israel and be provided for. This just does not mean that the master purchased ownership of the child, but actually acquired their productivity. In return, they would provide them with security, food, and shelter. Many people have a problem with the word possession, or rather the word property, as some translations such as the NIV and ESV render the Hebrew word achazah. They simply applied the wrong definition to it. The word possession does not mean that one owns what they possess, in the way that a slave trader owned their slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. When we look at the Hebrew word, it does not mean literal ownership, but rather the state of having something, being in possession of that something. The Israelites had possession of the land. However, they did not actually own the land. The land did not belong to them. They were simply in possession of it. The land actually belongs to God, as God himself states. Leviticus 25:23. The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine. For ye are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the land of your possession ye shall grant redemption for the land. When we go back and look at verses 45 and 46, what we will see is that God, rather than subjecting the stranger to be a slave forever, was actually protecting the stranger forever. During the year of Jubilee, as we have already seen, all debts were cancelled and all servants were free to go back to their families and their land, as we have seen. However, unlike the Israelite servants who would return back to their own home, families and lands, again as we have already seen, the stranger had no land to which to go back to. If they were released, then they would have nowhere to go. Therefore God made a commandment of the Israelites, not that the stranger would remain their slave, but that the stranger should continue to reside with them, even after the year of Jubilee. The command, far from endorsing the enslavement of the stranger forever, actually served to safeguard the stranger's well-being forever. They were not to simply release them, as this would essentially make the stranger homeless and jobless. They were their possession, not that they owned them, but that they were in possession of them, and it was the responsibility of the Israelite to continue allowing the stranger to sojourn with them after the Jubilee. This responsibility would be passed down from father to son. When the father died, the son was obligated to continue allowing the stranger to reside with him, and the stranger would continue working for the family. It must be noted that back in verses 39 and 40 of Leviticus 25, the Israelite brother is not to serve as a bondservant, but as a hired servant, and as a sojourner. Leviticus 25:39. And if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. The Israelite brother should be treated as the sojourner. The Hebrew word here is toshab. Now, if the Israelite brother is to be treated as a sojourner, then if we know how the Israelite was to be treated, which we have already seen was not as a slave, then we can say that the sojourner was not to be treated as a slave. When we look into the Bible, we will see that there are numerous verses that state exactly this. There is a command to love the stranger as yourself. Leviticus 19:33. If a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him, but the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Exodus 23:9. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:17. For the Lord your God is God of gods, and Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, and love the stranger, in giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, him shalt thou serve, and to him shalt thou cleave, and swear by his name. God actually warns that any oppression of the stranger would lead to death. Exodus 22:21. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry out unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Any servant that flees from his master to another was to be kept safe, and was not to be returned back to the master that they had fled from. Deuteronomy 23:15. Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. This clearly then would mean that any servant who did not wish to remain a servant, who left their master, was freed from that servitude. All of this can only constitute the very clear condemnation of a stranger being made to serve with rigour, or of any other way than that of an Israelite servant who was not to serve with rigour. The stranger was even able to obtain wealth via his master to the extent that an Israelite would sell themselves unto the stranger, which is found in Leviticus 25:47 through 55. So this leaves us with the slavery of the other nations of the Israelites. We know that the Israelites were servants in Egypt. The slavery that was imposed upon the Israelites would be far more like the slavery of the transatlantic slave trade. They were afflicted. They had taskmasters set over them. Their lives were made bitter with hard bondage, and they were forced to serve with rigour. Exodus 1:8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when they falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigour. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigour. None of this was to be imposed on anyone that served in Israel, Israelite or stranger. The language that is used to describe the servitude, the slavery of the Israelites, is never used for those that were servants in Israel. In fact, quite the opposite, with much of the same language used in that which was forbidden. So there are numerous texts that condemn the mistreatment of a stranger. They were not to be slaves, but servants, who were to be provided for and well treated by their masters. When correctly understood, there are no verses that condone the enslavement of strangers or Israelites. But what about the passage that says a master can beat his slave even to death, as long as he doesn't die the same day? And this is found in Exodus chapter 21. Exodus 21:20. If a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. Now this does not mean that a master could simply beat their slaves whenever they felt like it. This one verse is actually in a passage dealing with different personal injuries and their punishments. Now corrective punishment, not just of servants but for all of those in Israel, was permitted. Deuteronomy 25:1. If there be controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, that the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, then the judge shall cause him to lie down, and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. Now this was only for the wicked. Again, there was no prison system in Israel. The verse in question deals with the abuse of that corrective punishment. If the master was to use such corrective punishment that the servant died immediately, this would be considered murder, and so the master would be punished. The punishment for murder was the death penalty. So if the master murdered his servant, he was to be punished. He was to be put to death. If the master beat his servant, that the servant did not die immediately, then this would not be classed as murder, and the master would not therefore be punished with the death penalty. Just 5 verses later, there is a command that if the master was to cause any physical damage to their servant, then that servant was to be released. Exodus 21:26. And if a man smite the eye of his servant, or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth, or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. There simply is no condoning of a master simply beating a servant as they so wished. I shall deal with one last passage that is often cited as evidence that God allowed the slavery, and in fact rape, of women and children, which is found in Numbers chapter 31. Numbers 31:17. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. It is asserted here by those that say slavery is not condemned in the Bible, that God commanded that the Israelites spare the women who were virgins, and that they could keep them for themselves, meaning they could do what they wanted with them. They could make them their sex slaves. Of course, the verse doesn't say this in any way, shape, or form. This is literally read into the text, a command, or at least an acceptance of a vile and evil act that simply is not there. I rather think this says more about the person making the claim, but hey, what other possible explanation than God telling the Israelites to capture, imprison, and sexually abuse the virgin women could there be? It cannot go without saying that many, if not all of these Israelite men, would have been married and had families. To say that these men took sex slaves would also imply that the women were perfectly fine with them doing so. There is also not one verse that actually states that the men did in fact take them as sex slaves. It is nothing more than dishonest to read this into the verse and then use this understanding that has been read into the verse as an attack against the Bible. In reality, the argument is nothing more than a straw man. Apart from the simple fact that the verse does not say what it is claimed it does, there are a number of other problems with this understanding, if you can even call it that. I think unsupported presumption and downright dishonesty is probably better, but anyway. The first problem that we have is a little thing called context, and it turns out that this is vitally important when trying to ascertain a correct answer. The verse in Numbers 31 is not a standalone verse. There is context. We must read the Bible as a whole, or otherwise we will end up with wild accusations such as this. When done so, the Bible itself explains exactly why things that seem evil and condemning against the Bible, when a verse is taken out of context, are not in fact evil and condemning. They become much more clear in context. So let's add some context back into this verse. The events of this story happened before Israel had entered into the Promised Land. They were still wandering in the wilderness, being led by God. The Israelites were told to smite, kill the Midianites, because of what they had done regarding the Midianite women. Numbers 25:17. Vex the Midianites and smite them, for they vex you with their wiles, wherewith they have beguiled you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the prince of Midian, their sister, which was slain in the day of the plague for Peor's sake. This was not a command to commit genocide. Although all the men are stated as having been killed, the Midianites would attack Israel later. This was not all the Midianites, just certain tribes of the Midianites. Let's first find out who the Midianites were. They were the sons of Abraham through Keturah, Genesis 25:11. Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. The context of the story starts back in verse 1 of chapter 31. The Israelites went to war with the Midianites. This was a command of God. They were to avenge the children of Israel. Numbers 31:1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Afterward shalt thou be gathered unto thy people. And Moses spoke unto the people, saying, Arm some of yourselves unto the war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian. So Moses commanded Israel to go to war. 1,000 men from each tribe went to war with the Midianites. That's 12,000 men in total. Numbers 31:4. Of every tribe 1,000, throughout all the tribes of Israel, shall ye send to the war. So there were delivered out of the thousands of Israel 1,000 of every tribe, 12,000 armed for war. The Israelites won the war with the Midianites and slew, as in they killed, all the men of Midian. And this included all the kings of Midian. Numbers 31:7. And they warred against the Midianites, as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males. And they slew the kings of Midian, besides the rest of them that were slain, namely Evi, and Recham, and Zur, and Hur, and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. Balaam, also the son of Beor, they slew with the sword. However, the Israelites returning from the war had saved, as in not killed, the women of Midian. They had taken them captive along with the children. Numbers 31:9. And the children of Israel took the women of Midian captives, and their little ones, and took the spoil of all of their cattle, and all of their flocks, and all their goods. A captive does not mean slave, it means prisoner. The women were taken as prisoners. It is possible to make a prisoner a slave, but the term captive itself does not indicate this. Moses, after he sees that they have kept the women, asks why they have done this. Numbers 31:15. And Moses said unto them, Have you saved all the women alive? Moses then tells the Israelites that it is these women that had caused the children of Israel to commit a trespass against the Lord, which had in turn caused the plague among the people of Israel. Numbers 31:16. Behold, these caused the children of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. So Moses ordered that all the women be killed. Numbers 31:17. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that is known man by lying with him. The event, the matter of Peor, that Moses refers to here is found in Numbers chapters 24 and 25. The Midianites had convened with the Moabites in order to come against the children of Israel and seduce them into idolatry. We see that the people of Israel began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. Numbers 25:1. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. The Hebrew translated as whoredom is zana, and it's harlotry. So the people were going astray with the women of Moab. We know by verse 6 that they were also doing this with the women of the Midianites. Numbers 25:6. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. We even see the Israelites who held high respect engaging in this act with a Midianite woman. Numbers 25:14. Now the name of the Israelite that was slain, even that was slain with the Midianitish woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a prince of a chief house among the Simeonites. And the name of the Midianitish woman that was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was head over a people, and of a chief house of Midian. The women also caused the people to sacrifice to their gods and bow down to them. Israel joined itself to Baal Peor, which brought about the anger of God. Numbers 25:2. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat, and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. God then commanded that all the Israelites who had joined themselves with Baal Peor were to be killed. Numbers 25:4. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the heads of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor. 24,000 Israelites were killed during the plague. Numbers 25:9. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. Now it is after this that Moses stated that the women who had not known a man, had not had sex, they were not to be killed. Numbers 31:18. But all the women, children, that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. So we see that the reason the women who had not known a man were to be spared was rather simple. They were innocent of the act of leading the Israelites into the trespass against the Lord. It had absolutely nothing to do with the Israelites using them as sex slaves because they were virgins at all. Rather, they were spared because, as virgins, they were innocent of leading the Israelites into a trespass and had not engaged in the ritual sex acts. It was therefore not their virginity for which they were spared, but their innocence. Being virgins was simply a sign of that innocence for which they were spared. We must also understand that the women that remained had nothing left. The men had all been killed, the cities destroyed, and the cattle all taken by the Israelites as spoils of war. Far from the Israelites taking these women and doing as they pleased with them, it was now the responsibility and the obligation of the Israelites to take them in and take care of these women. As we already know, the Israelites were commanded to take care of the stranger. They were not to be used as simple sex slaves. In fact, there were even laws that were given regarding the Israelites' men and taking the women that remained after war to be their wives if they so wished. Deuteronomy 21:10. When thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them unto thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest amongst the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head, and par her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. Now there is no specific clarification here on whether the woman chosen by the Israelite to be his wife had any say in the matter. However, when we understand that an Israelite was not to oppress or mistreat a stranger, it is unlikely that they would be allowed to force marriage. This clearly goes against any understanding that God was allowing the Israelites to make sex slaves of the young virgin girls of the Midianites. There is simply no context that would give the understanding that the Israelite men were allowed to do as they wished with these women. As already pointed out, there is also not one passage that can be cited as evidence that shows the Israelites doing such. There most certainly is no command or condoning of the act. When we look at slavery in context and understanding, the claim that God condoned slavery is simply false. Slavery is condemned, and the Israelites, although they were themselves enslaved, were not to partake in the act. The Bible does not condone slavery. Thank you very much for listening to the Following Truth podcast. I hope the information has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.